There's a lot of different research. Like for me, I have to think about safety, which I don't think most artists think about in their research practice. Yeah, and then I have to think about how to make these things. Because I'm a poet, my ideas, like I just get ideas and then I have to work backward and figure out how to make the thing.
Hello, and welcome to Art Restart, where we explore how artists are reinventing their fields and building a new landscape for the arts. My name is Piercarlo Talenti. I'm the producer and editor of this podcast, which is brought to you by the Thomas S. Keenan Institute for the Arts at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. In this episode, we'll be speaking with Cuban American multimedia artist Antonia Wright. Antonia is based in Miami, Florida, and her work has been exhibited all over the world, from the Hirschhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in Washington, D.C., and the Pérez Art Museum in her hometown, to the Havana Biennial and the Faena Arts Center in Buenos Aires. The focus of her work tends to be the human body and how it responds to extremes of emotion, control, and violence promulgated by systems of power. And in the past, she's often used her own body, often in startling and violent ways, to illustrate her themes. Her tools are varied. They include video, photography, light, and sculpture, and she continues to invent new ways to communicate her themes. In 2021, she transformed a cement mixer into a giant musical instrument for her project Not Yet Paved. And recently, she's been creating site-specific installations with the kinds of barricades that you always see at protests the world over. Her interest in examining the autonomy and lack thereof of the human body, particularly the female body, extends to her personal life. She has long been an advocate and activist for reproductive rights, and she serves on the board of Planned Parenthood of South, East, and North Florida. Now, as you probably know, Florida's most stringent law restricting abortion came into effect on May 1st of this year, which is why I was really eager to speak with Antonia soon after. I wanted to hear how a change-making artist continued or recommitted to her work when the socio-political winds around her shifted so dramatically. So first, I asked her if she would describe a piece she created 2 years ago when the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade.
Sure. Well, I came to see the damage that was done and the treasures that prevail was a solo show that I made in 2022 as a reaction to the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And the whole show was a protest against the reproductive rights crisis in our country. And every piece in there talked about, the reproductive body. And I showed it at Spinello Projects, which is the gallery that represents me. But one of the main pieces in this show was an algorithm that I wrote. It was a code called State of Labor. And in this code, I took all the data for how far people had to travel to get an abortion before Roe was overturned, and then the increase in mileage a person had to travel after Roe being overturned. So I partnered with the Guttmacher Institute, which is the leading center on abortion data in the world, and I got all this data by state. So the code, it shows the increase in mileage a person now has to travel by state to get an abortion with the overturning of Roe. And so I wrote this code, and what it is it's called a data sonification. And so it sonifies this data. And the sounds that I used in this installation were collected with a midwife. I partnered with a midwife, and she was my midwife, actually. And she recorded all of the sounds of her patients in childbirth. And so I made a contract and I told her my idea. And then at some point in working with, I say women, but I include women, trans, and non-binary people with this term. Sometime in working with one of her patients, she'll tell them, I'm working with an artist and she wants some of your audio when you're in active childbirth. Would this be okay? And there's no visual, there's no video, and it's all anonymous. And so if the person says yes, they sign this contract, and then I'll wake up in the morning and I'll get an email that says, new baby. And so then I'll download the audio. And what I do is I edit it into two different categories. Childbirth is like this very long experience, and people make all different kinds of sounds. And there's two real different kinds of sounds people make. One is like the softer sounds that people make between contractions. And that sounds a lot like breathing, Sometimes people sing. Sometimes it sounds like lovemaking. But then when the contraction comes, that's like the full on, the most painful part of childbirth. And so I edit all the sounds into two categories. And then what I do is I attach the softer audio to the mileage that people used to drive pre-row. And then I attached all the audio of the intense, really full on labor sound to the increase in mileage. So, like, to give you an example, in Florida, we used to have very unrestricted abortion policies. Like, we had up to fetal viability in Florida because we have strict privacy rights in our Constitution. So we used to be able to drive on average 13 miles to get abortion care in the state. And now this number has increased to 583 miles, which is North Carolina. So if you are pregnant by 6 weeks and 1 day.
So this is really as of 2.5 weeks ago.
Well, no, it was time stamped 2022 because even back then. Yeah, we had a 15-week abortion ban. They changed our laws. And yeah, it's changing every day too, as well. But but now it's still the same. You still have to travel 583 miles to get an abortion after 6 weeks, and before it was after 15 weeks. So when you go into this installation, it's a dark room, and you just listen. And when you hear a softer sound, that like the softer sounds of labor, that's a shorter distance the person has to travel. And then the louder the scream is the farther the distance the person has to travel. And so that was the installation that was in the show.
You must have lurked in the shadows and witnessed people experiencing it. What did you overhear?
Well, that was the interesting part. I mean, a lot of time people didn't know. It's generative, so it's always changing. Like once I turn on this code, this algorithm, it's constantly changing. And there's 100 different sounds that have been collected and programmed into it. So you'll never hear the same thing twice. And yeah, people came out of there. People were crying. Some people couldn't handle it at all. It was a whole different range. But it's interesting because, what we hear of as labor is like very much a Hollywood version of what we think women sound like in childbirth. It's sort of like, baby, and like, it's going
to be abbreviated for dramatic purposes.
Yeah,
right?
It's so far from what the actual experience is. And I almost think of it, how they talk about the male gaze in art? I almost think of it as like a sonic gaze. It's like of women's voices and what they think we should sound like. And after Roe was overturned, women were really angry. And I wanted to hear from women's voices themselves. So in the installation, you hear a lot of pain. And if you force somebody to have a child they do not want to have, you take away their autonomy for the rest of their lives. So you hear this pain, but then you also hear this vulnerability. And it's also incredibly powerful.
So I'm speaking to you today, just 16 days after Florida made abortion illegal after 6 weeks since a woman's last menstrual period. In the law included is a mandatory 24-hour delay, so a woman has to visit her doctor at least 24 hours apart twice, which places even more of a time pressure on her. Given the effort and time you've put into your art and also through your volunteering towards women's reproductive rights, how are you doing?
Oh, I mean, it's devastating. It really is. But we've been in this for years. This isn't new. I mean, they passed a abortion ban on July 1st, and they installed that 24-hour waiting period July 1st. So we've been dealing with this, and it's not just for Floridians. It's for most of our patients now are from out of state. And so what the 24-hour waiting period does is it's supposed to cause a woman to feel shame and to like reverse her decision, which is ridiculous because it means that a woman can't make her own decision. Also, it just clogs up our system. That means 2 doctor's appointments. And so sometimes people can't get an appointment before 15 weeks, and then they would have to go to another state. So no, I've been in a heightened state of, devastation for years. And even before the overturning of Roe, I would say this has been happening. Like I went to the Women's March of Washington. I think that was January 1st, 2021, the day after Trump was elected. And I heard all those speeches and I was like, they are going to overturn Roe. they're going to do it. And then when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, I was like, there goes Roe. And so, yeah, no, I've been like in this world of anxiety for a long time, I would say. But on the positive, the day that they signed the 6-week abortion ban into place here, they also approved our ballot initiative.
That's right.
Yes. So there is hope.
I have kind of a pragmatic question, which is more on the business side of your art making, which is some of your art is public art installations, which means that your funding comes partly from municipalities or foundations. When political or societal winds shift, does that make you more vulnerable than, say, a studio painter who largely sells her work to collectors?
I know it is an interesting thing. I didn't know what was going to happen, with my last show, but then the Pérez Art Museum Miami bought my piece about abortion in the state of Florida, which makes me respect them even more. Yeah. So no, I don't think about that when I make the work. I just make the work I want to make, and then I hope that it, lands in the right audience with the right people.
How do you negotiate with a municipality, let's say, that commissions you to create a public installation? To what extent do they have any requirements about the content?
No, I've never been like censored on anything, but I think people know who I am going into it.
Hopefully they did their due diligence and have some idea of whom they're commissioning, right?
Yes, like one of my goals is always to try to say the word abortion out loud as many times as I can, that it's not this word that needs to be like whispered anymore. It's healthcare. There's nothing to be ashamed about.
Let's go back to how you decided to become such an artist with so many skills and interests. You started out as a poet, is that correct?
I did.
Which is such a solo, it's as solo an art as I can think of. And then you gradually became someone who creates work out and for the public, often in collaboration. Can you describe that journey? What made you make that switch?
Well, yeah, I went to graduate school for poetry. I went to the New School in New York City. And when I was there, I was working at the New School's writing program and helping to them organize their reading series. And I was going to a lot of readings. And I started realizing that a lot of these poetry books that I had read on my own, when I went to hear the poet speak the work, the meaning of the work was totally different from what I imagined it to be. Like if I would read a poem and think it was so serious. And then I would hear the poet read the work and think, oh, this is so funny. It's just really dry humor. It's like, and it was all in the intonation. And I was obsessed with this. And even when I was reading my own work, it's like performativity that was really enticing to me about these poetry readings. And I started talking to my friends about it. And they're like, well, have you ever heard of performance art? And I said, no. And so then they're like, well, you've got to check out some of these, performance artists. And so I did. And I found artists like Vito Acconci, who's a poet. And, he did this piece where he was following people on the street. And the next thing, I started following people on the street. And I was like, this is so fun. This feels like poetry to me, but with the body. And so I got really into performance art and started making my own work. And then I realized that I needed the skills to be able to capture it in a way that I wanted to. And so then I went to the International Center of Photography to learn how to take photos and make videos of this kind of work. And then from there, I discovered, I went in for photography and then I left like making video because I realized like time had entered the work and it needed real time. And then I just hit the ground running and I made performances for video and photography or live audiences for about 10 years. And then I hit a point with that where I was like, well, I could keep working with my own body, or maybe I should try something different. And so I said, well, what about sculpture? Could sculpture be a surrogate for the body? And so that's where I've been in for the last couple of years, I would say, with my work. And now sound and light.
Because you really used to put your body in display and sometimes be quite violent with it, right? Or put it through its paces, let's say.
Yes, I used to do like very logistically challenging work, like throwing myself through sheets of glass or covering myself with bees, rode naked down alleys. I fell in a frozen lake for a video. Yeah, a lot of very, very physical body-based work.
What piece along that journey proved to have the most salient lessons for you as you were developing your craft?
Well, that's an interesting thing about performance art is there really is no manual on it. It's like this kind of work where, how do you show it? How does it live on? How do you sell it? Like all of these things. There's so many question marks to it. And I would say over time, I started learning really how to capture it. Like I would always, at first I used to shoot it
Because
all.
when you say sell, the only way to sell performance art is through the capturing of it, right?
Yeah, well, and even that, like people often say it's documentation, but I never use that word with my work because I'll shoot it something in like 4K and I'll sometimes redo a performance just for video. So I make, video work. Or also if you're thinking about a live performance, I'm thinking about how people are walking around the space and how they look up and down. And that's totally different from video art where you're just looking at the frame. Like all I'm doing is composing within that 16:9 frame. So it's different how I think about approach to each project, when I start work or show it. One of the last ones I was when I walked on and fell in this frozen lake in Lake Champlain, Vermont. And I flew up my whole crew to Vermont. And then we're out in the middle of this frozen lake. And at that point, I had somebody working the video. And then I had another person shooting photo because a video still isn't such good quality. And I just don't like that. So then I have a separate photographer. And then it's all these different things that you sort of learn how to capture it and then how to show it afterward. I would say that one is how I learned the most. And then how you install it.
And what about did you have people looking at your safety?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
how much rehearsal goes into a piece like that? You can't rehearse falling into a frozen lake. That can only happen once, but how do you prepare for that?
Yeah, well, the safety part of it is a huge piece of the research. I practice sometimes for months, and I'll never do everything until all the components, until the day of, because what I like about performance art is that anxiety that you get. And I find the more anxiety I have, the more if it's felt by the audience. And so I like not knowing what is going to happen per se, even though I've kind of practiced all the components in my head so many times. But before it used to just be me and my tripod in my studio, and that was it. But now sometimes I have a whole group of people out on the frozen lake, and it's my responsibility to make sure they're all safe too. So
right.
In that instance, I just start talking to as many people as I can and just asking lots and lots of questions. And I realized for that one, we needed ice divers in the lake in case the lake broke and we all fell in. So that was our safety for that one. But each project is so different.
So how many people did you have? How big a crew did you have on that project?
5 people plus myself, plus 5 people are my team, and then the ice divers.
What fascinates me about your work is that not only obviously do you research the heck out of your subject matter, but also you have to, as we've been talking about, research your materials and your process. What do you particularly love about that? And what have you learned about your own capacities through that kind of research?
Yeah, there's a lot of different research. Like for me, I have to think about safety, which I don't think most artists think about in their research practice. Yeah, and then I have to think about how to make these things. Because I'm a poet, my ideas, I just get ideas, and then I have to work backward and figure out how to make the thing. So it's always like a puzzle piece, and that's one big part of it. And then the research and the materials, I think I've realized more and more that I used to just think about the ideas and then kind of move forward. But now I try to think about barricades. I've been working with barricades for years. But then now I look back to the whole history of barricade. Where was the first barricade ever? And it's from the word barricade means barrel in French. So I sort of, to the barricades, that whole idea. So yeah, now I'm thinking about research a lot as I move forward.
I love to talk in this podcast about systemic reinvention, particularly post-pandemic. And I wonder if you can think of any ways, any systems currently, either in the way you bring your art to your audience or in the way you get funding, that could really be re-examined and reshaped so you and performance artists like you would find it much easier to bring their art to the public.
I think it's hard because for artists sometimes it feels like you have to do everything. Like you have to stay in a place where you're inspired to make good work and feel good, to make good work. And then you have to make it. You have to get the funding for it and then make it and then find a place to show it. And then you have to promote it, all the things. So if there was somehow to help artists with all those steps, like there's a meme that goes around where it's like, I am my own publicist, my own website designer, my own fabricator, my own this, my own that, my own everything. But that you learn along the way. And as you get bigger, I think you can outsource some of that stuff. But
well, you figure it out. Do you see other talented colleagues who falter in that they're great artists, but they don't have the know-how to tackle the other things you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it is a little tiring sometimes to do all of that. But I try to, I actually like doing all of that. I like outsourcing it too. but I do like doing a lot of it. Yeah, I think for artists, you should just ask around and how other artists have their systems, and you learn from each other how they handle different things. Like, what do you use for this? And what do you use for that? And that's like an invaluable resource, I always think. But just more grants for artists. I would say at the end of the day, that's the most helpful thing for an artist.
Reading about a lot of your barricade inspired or pieces, the pieces that include barricades, I know one of your inspirations was the Hong Kong protests. And as we know, so many of those people either had to flee Hong Kong or were imprisoned. And then, of course, we know what's happened in terms of reproductive rights in Florida. So I want to talk about how you maintain a practice of hope. You talked about how you like to put rage into your work, but is there a way you take care of yourself through that?
Yes. I mean, I do think a lot of my work, and this is sort of a mantra of mine, is like ecstasy and anxiety. I think that like I read the newspaper every day and I have this sort of anxiety, but then in my day-to-day world, it's so full of hope and joy, and the people I work with are so great, and I get to be an artist. Like, that's just a dream for me. It's my passion, it's my calling. And so I think it's always, life is like this kind of balance between ecstasy and anxiety. I think that's where I land on that. Like in the middle. Like if you look at like I heard an interview the other day with Gloria Steinem, and they were asking her, they were like, so you're here, you're fighting for women's rights, all these injustices against oppression, but every picture I see of you, you're laughing. Like, how is that? And she's like, well, you can't force a person to laugh. That is true autonomy, is laughter. And so I find, especially I'm on the board of Planned Parenthood, and the people there are some of the most exceptional people I've ever worked with, and I find so much joy when we work together. And so it's that community, I think, that sort of fuels my work, or gives me self-care too, I would say.
Thinking back on when you first started diving into performance art back when you were at the New School, is there anything, if you could go back and whisper something in Antonia's ear at that point, what do you think might have been most useful?
I don't think I would have said anything, because if I would have said at that point, drop out and, maybe just study art or something, then I wouldn't have gone to where I am now. And I like all of the sort of turns that I've taken, from poet to performance to photography to video to sculpture to sound. It's been fun. I've learned along the way.
It does sound like you love to surprise yourself.
Yes, I do. Another one of my mantras is be daring and insightful. And I try to take as many risks as I can. And even if that means starting a project where I know nothing about what I'm doing, I know that I'll learn a lot, in that process.
Can you talk about an upcoming project, or maybe a project that's kind of in the research phase at this point?
Well, I'm working on a piece now. It's almost done, but it's still in the research phase, I would say. But I have been noticing laser pointers found in resistance movements. So protesters are now using laser pointers as a way to avoid facial recognition technology. In Hong Kong, they were using them. It started in Egypt in 2024.
Oh.
And then they were using them, in Hong Kong, especially to avoid scrambling facial recognition technology. And then also...
So you wave the laser pointer in front of your face, basically? Is that...
No, you can point it at like a drone.
Oh, I see.
Or
Any kind of surveillance apparatus.
Sensor. Yes.
Gotcha.
But these are pointers that are used in boardrooms, to point at a board or to play with your cat. And now protesters are fighting in these very asymmetrical systems of power where they're, up against riot police and they have a cat laser in their hand to defend themselves. It's really incredible. And in Chile, in South America, they use them against a really oppressive police system. And the protesters there actually won. And now they're rewriting the country's constitution. And so I just think this is like the ultimate of, subverting this technology that was actually developed by the military to now, be back in the hands of these protesters. So, but the thing about them, I look at images from protests because the barricades and like a lot of my work is looking at images of protests. And I started seeing these images of these protesters with these laser pointers in their hands. And I was like, whoa, but this is weird. Does anybody else think this looks like a rave? This is the weirdest aesthetic that I've ever seen. Like, is this what protest is going to look like in the future? And so I started Googling all the headlines for this, and it was like protesters put on laser light show. And then I found one from Vox that actually said, does anybody else think that the Hong Kong protests look like a rave? And it said that protesters put on a light show to rival any rave. And I was like, whoa, this is so weird. So then I started looking into the similarities between protests and raves. And then I commissioned a musician, and they have written an audio score for me that takes all found protest audio and then sets it to 128 beats per minute, like EDM music. And I have programmed these laser lights to go to this audio score. And so it's an immersive installation of sound and light. This is what
wow. And where are you going to put it up?
This is in the works.
If you'd like to learn more about Antonia and see a few images of her work, please head to uncsa.edu/artrestart. That's where you'll also be able to read an edited version of this interview. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. Art Restart is on all the podcast platforms. Our theme music is by Shanghai Restoration Project. I'm Piercarlo Talenti, and on behalf of the Thomas S. Keenan Institute for the Arts, thank you for listening.